The Children Wellbeing and Schools Bill affects all parents, not just home educators, and here is why. I'm going to do as quick a run through as I can for you. I've not had a chance to do this before now properly, but here we go. I'm going to start off with some stats. And these are worth keeping in mind while I go through the rest of the bill with you. Now, Amy, also known as Ginger Snaps Online, sent me these stats and figures. And these stats relate to Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. And I honestly wish that we'd actually done the same in Liverpool. So when they did this survey, 37% of families were home educating due to bullying or school trauma. 28% of the families involved in the survey chose to do so for philosophical reasons. And 10% had chosen to electively home educate due to SEND needs. And for 68% of that 10% figure, it was their first choice, their primary choice. They wanted to electively home educate due to the child's SEND school, and school wasn't even an option for them. And what's interesting to note is that 48% of those who responded, those parents worked in the educational sector or still work in the educational sector. Now, one of the key components of this bill is what it implies. And it implies the school is the safest place for children to be. And the teachers can meet their well-being needs better than the parents. Yet, does this reflect reality? So, let's do a little poll ourselves. Put your hands up if you have had a difficult or troublesome time communicating with your child's school. Put your hand up if you've ever hit a wall when it comes to getting the appropriate SEND care and resources for your child. Put your hand up if after that SEND battle and you've got your EHCP, the school didn't have the funding, resources or training to actually implement the EHCP. And what's more, put your hand up if your child doesn't even have a school place due to SEND needs not being met. Put your hand up if your child was bullied at school for months on end with no resolution in sight and little practical support in place. Put your hand up if your child was chucked into isolation or segregation, whatever you want to call it, because they were a victim of bullying. And the school thought, oh, it's safer to put them in there instead. And therefore they missed out on core lessons. Put your hand up if this happened to your SEND child because the needs couldn't be met. And finally, and I could go on, put your hand up if your child has school refusal or school avoidance and you can't even get them there and there's a lack of support and understanding in that. Like the very system is set up for failure. This new bill threatens our rights as parents to be involved with and support our child's well-being in school and at home. It's an attack on our parental rights as a nation. Schools and local authorities will have the authority and powers to override your preferences as a parent for your child's school education and also for your child's home education. Again, this bill affects us all. The media seems to be pushing it from a home ed viewpoint and using lots of fear-mongering and propaganda in order to do so. But by doing this, they are minimising the effect that it's going to have on the parents of mainstream and SEND provision children. The amount of parents that I've spoken to that don't even know that the Child Wellbeing and Schools Bill affects them personally is absolutely astounding. And that is by design. Home education is not a safeguarding risk, no more so than leaving a toddler or a child before the age of 5 at home with their parents is a risk. And the home ed community is full of parents making sacrifices daily to meet the educational and emotional and mental needs of their children. Ideally, the money back in this bill should be actually channeled into funding and improving the services and safeguarding methods we already have in place. We already have the regulations there, and we already have the services in place, such as social services. They just need improving and better training. And unfortunately, because of the propaganda going around, I am going to have to touch on Sarah Sharif. That poor child was known from birth to social services. The school and social services were aware that she was at risk, yet failed in their duty of care to protect her, and now they're trying to pass the buck to the home ed community. The money fueling this bill could be used to tighten that very net that failed children like Sarah Sharif. Because sadly, she is not the only one. It could be used to improve the SEND resources and training for mainstream education. It could be used to funnel money into the local authorities or the elective home education teams that we have already in place, if they're so worried about our children's education. On average, each year, around 68% of children fail their GCSEs after 13 years in mainstream education. Now, this money could be funneled into that to bring those numbers down, so more children are passing the GCSEs after leaving school and not having to repeat them in college afterwards. There's so much this magic money tree could actually do that would bring about effective change. Instead, they're using this bill to further restrict your parental rights, to give themselves more control over our children, instead of tackling and trying to minimise the issues and problems that are within the mainstream education system and our safeguarding procedures. It's worth noting that there's actually a website dedicated to a certain kind of abuse that takes place in schools of a certain nature, and they produce all the stats, and there's almost a daily occurrence across UK schools. So that's worth Googling it and looking into. And when it comes to home ed and the local authority, there's already known cases out there where they've overstepped their remit, the legislation, which is essentially the law. They've overstepped their rights. And I'm not looking at you, Portsmouth. I'm not, honest. The general mantra that children are safer in school is not the lived experience for many parents. For instance, my own child, who are now in the 20s, I'm not going to reveal which one, was attacked with a bladed article in school, in the school building, 8 years ago. And since then, that type of crime has only increased. Children need an environment conducive to their education, ideally one that can cater to their individual learning styles. And unfortunately, in a classroom of 30, I can tell you as an ex-teacher, that is pretty much impossible to do. If a child is stressed, anxious or depressed, or not having their SEND needs met, then they are not going to be learning or absorbing anything. There will be no long-term retention, no genuine learning taking place. Now, what I advise you to do is go away from watching this. I mean, if you've watched it this far, read the bill in full and compare it to your current rights as a parent. Know exactly what rights the government are removing here. Know exactly what rights you're willingly giving up. And history has proven, once we give our rights up, you very rarely ever get them back again. I mean, do we all truly trust this government with the well-being of our children? Really? Do we? School teachers are already suffering from long-term stress. They're already in fight or flight mode, with many teachers stating that they are struggling to meet the needs of their pupils, and 9 times out of 10, they're having to fund resources themselves out of their wages because the funding just isn't there. Many teachers are crying out for more appropriate SEND training. And now, many of you may not be aware, but there is a push from government to get SEND children back into mainstream education, without any plans to address the lack of training and facilities available for them in a mainstream educational setting. And sadly, this also includes children with advanced disability needs too. There's no way the teachers that are already overstretched, pushed to the limit, can meet the needs of children with severe care needs, care requirements day to day, whilst also trying to meet the well-being needs of the class and teach. In addition to that, other studies showed that it's on average 3 out of 10 children with severe mental health complaints at this moment in time, conditions that are requiring to be watched for certain idealisations. So if you're in a classroom of 30, that's on average 9 kids that as a teacher you're already having to watch to ensure that they don't disappear somewhere to do something that they can never come back from again. And that's before you've even got to the children with the advanced care needs, and before you can even start to deliver the teaching material. The strain and stress that this government intend to put on the education system when there's already so many cracks there is going to have devastating consequences for all our children. The government is so out of touch with reality here. Before anything like this bill is introduced, they need to ensure our schools are performing well and the safeguarding is adequate. And anybody that doesn't think that this bill is about control, if it wasn't about control, they'd have already addressed the issues causing problems day to day in our children's education system. And our safeguarding procedures too. They'd have been focused on funneling the money there. Instead, it's a bill that erodes some of our parental rights. Now, Casey Wolf stated, thank you Ginger for this quote, that this bill represents the greatest undermining of parental rights in the history of our educational law. And if that doesn't have parents questioning this whole bill, I honestly don't know what will. It's unthinkable that a parent removing their child from the school system due to prolonged bullying or even assault with a bladed article could face imprisonment for doing so. Or if they have a child that is attempting to leave the safely plane due to school trauma, if they are to remove that child, they could face imprisonment. How is that putting the well-being of our children first as a nation? Sending your child into an environment where they feel unsafe day after day, prolonging their trauma, how is that conducive to their well-being? And in addition to that, the data sharing in this bill is alarming in itself. It just doesn't align with GDPR. And for instance, will affect mothers fleeing domestic violence, for example, or fathers fleeing domestic violence. There are thousands of cases of leaked data from the schools and from social services when it comes to those instances already. We already have instances of the LA failing children known to them and known to their care. And now they're going to put more pressure on an already stretched services, but give them more powers. This is just going to allow more children to fall through the cracks again. It doesn't actually save the children in any way. And another point is allowing the schools to veto deregistrations from the point of this bill going forward is actually alarming in itself, because that's a conflict of interest when the school gets money and funding per child. They're not going to want to let that go. Not, of course, unless they're trying to off-roll the child. And there's also a SEND crisis going on across the nation. I mean, we wouldn't have the SEND reform going on, the protests for that going on, and that movement and all the hard work those parents are doing wouldn't be required if there wasn't a SEND crisis going on in this country. Yet the government have introduced the DFE safety valve scheme. So if you're a SEND parent, you need to get familiar with that as well. And then when you marry it against this bill, the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill, when you marry the two together, it's actually quite alarming, and it builds a bigger picture yet again. But it highlights just how important meeting our children's needs and well-being actually is to this government. But if this bill passes, you won't actually have the powers as a parent to fight this legally. It's also worth looking up the Good Childhood Report from 2024 as well. Do your research before giving up your rights and everybody else's rights as a parent. Do your research properly. Because it's not just our generation's rights. These are the rights of our children's children, and their children's children that we're giving up here. And like I said earlier, once you've given up right, it's very, very hard to get them back again. We have a duty of care to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, to be 100% fully informed on these rights and what we are giving up as parents, what reins we are handing over to the government, because it's going to affect every future generation going forward.